This video is a request. I love requests. I don't know how many videos I start by saying I love a request, but I do love a request because then I know at least one person will watch the video. You would hope. Anyway, so this request came to me from a person and it popped up on my YouTube channel and I read it and it disappeared. So I don't know who wrote it and I don't know how it disappeared or where it's gone, but if you're the person that made this request and perhaps you deleted it, who knows? But I'm going to do it anyway because I thought it was a great request. So what was the request? The request was about camels used by Australia in the First World War. And then, as an afterthought, the person said, oh, well, what about the Boer War? So, here we go. Camels. I was thinking about making this video and putting a false hump on Cody's back or something, but where do you draw the line at how much trouble you go to? So anyway, camels. Australia is a huge continent. People, the classic are the English tourists that come to Australia and they've been looking at maps of England all their life and they go, oh yes, we'll take 3 days to go from John O'Groats to Land's End. That might be rushing it a bit to travel that distance in 3 days, but we'll make a nice holiday of it. Then when you look at a map and you see John O'Groats to Land's End, which is the tip of Scotland to the tip of England, the longest journey you can make in the UK, you have a look at that on a map of Australia. You're going to drive from Adelaide to Perth and you would leave John O'Groats and by the time you got to Land's End you might stop for a mid-morning coffee. And this is huge country. You think back to the horse era. Sorry mate, clipped him on the ear. I'm very sorry. Clipped him on the ear, waving my hands around like an Italian greengrocer. Anyway, no, do not get sidetracked with Italian greengrocer jokes. Where were we? Australia. Huge continent. No cars, no trucks, no trains even. Horses, it's very dry. Dry desert. Huge distances with no water at all. Everyone loves a horse, but they really should have a decent drink every single day. Camels. There's the answer. Camels. So very early on, entrepreneurs, when you think of Arabs and Afghans, these people have been trading and wheeling and dealing before the birth of Christ. They know wheeling, dealing, business and making money, making a living, hard work. So they brought their camels to Australia. Did you know today that camels are exported from Australia to the Arab countries? Why? Because we have no diseases, introduced diseases in Australia. We have no rabies, we have no foot and mouth, we have none of these diseases because our quarantine is so strict. So what happened back in the 1800s, I've been sidetracked here, what happened back in the 1800s is these Afghans and Arabs, they bring the camels out to Australia, they either escape or they're let go. Once the motor industry takes over, they simply let go. So in Australia, we have, I won't say millions, certainly hundreds and hundreds of wild, feral camels that have been growing up, born and raised in an environment they thrive in with no diseases and no predators to attack them, because our biggest predator really is the dingo, wild dog. And a dingo, they're usually only in twos, they're not often in packs, they're usually a mated pair. There's no way they're going to bring down a camel, especially when you think how big, tough, strong and vicious bull camels are. And so anyway, we're in the 1800s and we have got a thriving camel industry taking goods and chattels all across the country, through the desert country, to the point where a town of Maree in the northern parts of South Australia, in the desert, Maree, that actually becomes like a second home. Whole streets have become streets full of our Afghan families. They start planting dates. They have a massive date plantation. It's all gone now, sadly. Most of the big date trees now that they are elsewhere in South Australia. At least they didn't let them die. They dug them up and they transported them elsewhere in South Australia. You go to the Riverland in South Australia, massive date trees everywhere. They originally came from the Afghan settlements in Maori. But what happened is this jumping around too much? Are you with me so far? We're in the 1800s, mid-1800s, and the industry is thriving. They're doing a great job. There's no competition. There's not even the railways. How do you put a railway 3,000 miles through a desert when those flooding rain comes every 2 or 3 years that's so torrential it washes everything away? So, we now come to 1899. The 1800s are about to end, and we have the Boer War, the second Boer War officially, 1899 to 1902. And the English, British, whatever you're supposed to call them, they decide this is a serious war of attrition. They need camel convoys for transport, to transport food and water, ammunition. And so where are we going to get excellent English speaking, English understanding, English culture? Where are we going to get some of the best camel drivers in the world for these conditions? Australia. And so what happens is, it turns out that Australia provides not the camels. There's no camel regiments of Australians, but Australians supply very many camel handlers for the Second Boer War, 1899 to 1902. Of course, when the war's over, they go back plying their trade. And then we come to the First World War, 1914-18. And now things are a little different, because whereas in the Boer War we had the mounted rifles from Australia. We weren't actually a colony, we were different states. Each state sent its own mounted rifles. There's a sidetrack you can follow if you want to. I've made a couple of videos about the Boer War and about Breaker Morant and about Rule 303 and him being illegally shot by a firing squad. Go off and find all that rather than me rambling on there. But we do come to the First World War. We have the Australian Light Horse, now a single entity. We have the ANZACs. We have New Zealand with their mounted rifles as part of the ANZAC contingent of the Light Horse. And it's realised that, sadly, no, I shouldn't say sadly, but it's realised that camels make better trooper transport than horses in the desert. So yes, we have the British, the English, who have their camel transportation regiments and battalions, and those blokes are transport, like you would have in the Second World War. You had trucks. Those guys were the drivers of those trucks in the transport regiments, and that's what you had with the English. Australia was going to be different. Australia was going to do it differently. The Australian Light Horse was not cavalry. The Australian Light Horse were infantry with rifles who needed to get around quickly, and so they used horses. 4 men in a section, 4 men worked together, 3 jumped off, gave their reins to the 4th man, who took off the 4 horses off to safety so 3 men could fight. What they decided to do is they were going to do the same thing, except with camels. And so those guys, they weren't carrying food and water for all the troops. They weren't carrying boxes of ammunition. They were travelling exactly the same as the light horse were, their own personal canteen, their own rifle, their own personal ammo, except they were doing it on camels. The camels were about 5, so a horse really should have water every day. Camel could go 5 to 7 days easily without water. They were much more efficient in the desert. In January 1916, they officially set up the ANZAC Imperial Camel Corps. The thumbnail photo is a perfect example of a light horse trooper ready for combat, except he is using his camel to get to combat. When they set that up, there were 4 battalions wrapped up into one corps. There were about 770 men in each one of the 4. One was UK soldiers, not transport drivers. One was UK soldiers, about 770. One was New Zealand, 770. And 2 battalions were Australian light horsemen. They came off their horses and they went on to the camels. And so round it out to work it out for yourself. 4 lots of 770, dealing with around 4,000 camels. The Imperial Camel Corps fought from January 16 all the way through to the end of World War I, when hostilities ceased in November of 1918. And they were involved, you know, you see the movie The Light Horseman, and the horses galloping, the machine guns, they're under the guns. Well, the Camel Corps were at Beersheba. They were at all the major battles, but it's just like anything. Not everyone gets a Guernsey. Not everyone gets mentioned in the history books. Who gets mentioned more or less? So where we're at now then is the Imperial Camel Corps has lasted right the way through to the end of the war, November 1918. Is that the end for camels then? Because by the time the First World War is over, we come back to Australia and we are starting to have trucks and trains becoming more prevalent. We are finding a reduction in the use of camels. We find that all the camel drivers, all those families, they're going into other businesses. They're more profitable to move into other businesses. Some of them actually did go into trucking, but the trade in camels is dropping off, and so we're getting more and more mechanised as we move towards September of 1939 and World War II. Surely the Blitzkrieg and Germany with its mechanical power and good old Adolf, it's the end for camels. In Australia, there are still camels today. Would you believe it? The 26th Transport Regiment in the Australian Army still has 2 camels today, Penny and Vernon, but they are mascots. So yes, you can still see 2 camels in their World War I regalia today, but they are mascots for the Australian Army. So what happened in World War II with camels, you think? More videos for you to go and check out that we've previously done, because if ever there was a myth that is the myth beyond all myths, it is about the German army in World War II. You see the newsreels of the rushing tanks, not Russian, the hurrying tanks, the speeding trucks, the how many? Motorcycle, sidecar. It's all news, the media, it's all media and newsreel hype, because Germany had so few trucks. It commandeered every country that it went to, Poland, France, it just commandeered all the vehicles. They went into Russia with a hodgepodge collection of beat up, used, second-hand, stolen vehicles. And when they broke down, there were no parts for them. There were no interchangeable parts. They were just abandoned because they didn't have parts for a 1920 Citroen 2-cylinder truck or something that they'd been using to carry a squad of soldiers. Anyway, they relied massively on millions and millions of horses. The German army relied on millions and millions of horses for transport, and I struggle to talk about it and to explain it because, very quickly, summed up very briefly, pretty much they all got killed. One way or another, those poor horses, starved, overworked, appalling conditions, and at the end of it all, if they were still alive, they were eaten. So it is a horrendous story. But this is supposed to be about camels. And I'm getting at the point of, surely then there aren't camels in World War II. But yes, there were camels in World War II, because much like I've explained to you the Germans and the millions of horses they used in World War II, what about the Russians? Have you heard of Siberia? Yeah, of course you have. So there is lots of camels used in Russian, what's the word I'm looking for? The Russian Empire. Let's call it the Russian Empire. Encompasses much of Asia, and they use camels. So this is something else that you don't hear much about, is that when the Soviets made their big push all the way from Stalingrad, pushing the Germans all the way back, all the way to Berlin, 2,700 kilometres of constantly pushing. Many of those troops were Siberian troops, tough blokes, scarily tough blokes. And they had no trucks, they had camels. The camels were kept well back from the front line. They were so precious that they kept the camels well back from fighting an aerial attack, because those camels were carrying all their supplies, their food and their ammunition. So the Siberian regiments had 1,000 camels in their transport units that travelled from Stalingrad all the way to Berlin, and they were reputed to have carried 15,000 tons of equipment, ammunition on that 2,500 kilometre journey. And it is estimated that it would have taken approximately 150 trucks that didn't break down, that never had a failure, that always had fuel to do the same job, but the truck still might have got bogged. So on the slight off chance that you did know that the Russians had transport regiments of camels that assisted them in their push from Stalingrad to Berlin. Did you know about grasshopper? Surely you haven't heard of grasshopper. I'm going to have a go at pronouncing this. Kuznechik. So grasshopper is Russia's most famous camel, and that's because that camel set off from Stalingrad with his handler to help push the Germans back to Berlin, and the handler of that camel grasshopper, Kuznechik. The myth goes that that camel walked from the suburbs of Siberia, 2,700 kilometres, carrying its load all the way to Berlin, and when it got to the ruined city of Berlin, the handler said that grasshopper looked around and did a huge spit into one of the buildings. So that's the Russian myth about old grasshopper. Obviously historians have tried to do some research into grasshopper, and they do believe that sadly he didn't quite make it to Berlin, and that he was involved in some action on the Baltic Sea and was killed in a German air raid. That's the historian's version, whereas the handler's version has gone down in mythology, I guess you'd say, in the Russian memories of the fight against Germany in the Second World War. we'll see what stays in this video about his little fandango. Still don't know what it was. I've cut it out, but we went off for a little walk to see if I could find out what it was. Old Bill's standing over there. I don't know if Wild Bill's in the vision or not, but even Wild Bill was standing up on tippy toe, neck up, ears up, and that's all like, what's happening? What's happening? That's horses for you. Cheers, till next time.